Welcome to Wichita Liberty TV with Bob Weeks.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita, Kansas government and politics. We're broadcast on KGPT, channel 26.1, along with its companion website, kgpt26.com. Now, some of you may know me from my blog, The Voice for Liberty. It's at wichitaliberty.org on the internet. There you'll find the motto is individual liberty, limited government, and free markets in Wichita and Kansas. So I try to cover things that may not be covered by the Wichita Eagle or other TV stations or radio, or if we do cover the same news, I'll do it from the perspective of economic freedom, limited government, and individual liberty. So these are the things that are important. These are the things that are so often under attack by our governments, be it at the federal, state, and local level. So please visit wichitaliberty.org. You can subscribe to the email newsletter I send 2 or 3 times a week. And if you'd like to contact me, you can find my email address and telephone number there, or just remember bob.weeks@gmail.com. Well, Kansas schools are in the news for a variety of reasons. Often the news involves spending, with many groups insisting that school spending has been cut and that more money must be spent to save Kansas schools. These same people are often proud of the performance of Kansas students on national tests as compared to other states. Well, results from the 2013 administration of the National Test of Educational Progress have just been released. Let's take a look at the Kansas results. I'm Bob Weeks. Kansas school leaders are proud of Kansas schools, partly because of scores on the National Assessment of Educational Progress Test, or NAEP. Kansas ranks pretty high among the states on this test. NAEP is a test that's controlled by the federal government and is the same in all states. Data for the 2013 administration of the test was just released. I've gathered scores and made them available in a visualization that you can use at wichitaliberty.org. The most widely available NAEP data is for 2 subjects, reading and math, and for 2 grades, 4 and 8. Here's data for Kansas, Texas, and the average for national public schools. I choose to compare Kansas with Texas because for several reasons, Kansas has been comparing itself with Texas. So let's look at these test scores and see if the reality matches what Kansas school leaders have said. This is the data for the past 5 administrations of NAEP. Looking at this, with Kansas in blue, Texas in green, and national public schools in yellow, you can see why Kansas school leaders are proud of Kansas. The blue line representing Kansas is almost always the highest. NAEP also makes data available by ethnic subtypes. Here's the same chart, but this time showing black students only. Do you see something different? Now Texas is higher than Kansas in all cases but one, where there is a tie. Here's the same chart again, but showing Hispanic students only. Texas is higher in some cases, and Kansas and Texas are virtually tied in 2 others. Note that national public schools is higher than Kansas in some cases. Finally, here's the same chart, but showing white students only. Texas is higher than Kansas in 3 of 4 cases, and in some cases the national public school average beats or ties Kansas. So we have what seems to be 4 contradictory statements, but each in fact is true. That is, when considering all students, Kansas scores higher than Texas. When looking at Hispanic students only, Kansas is roughly equal to Texas. Looking at black students only, Kansas scores less than Texas, and when looking at white students only, Kansas scores less than Texas in most cases. How can this be? Well, the answer is something called Simpson's paradox, which shows that aggregated data can appear to reverse important trends in the numbers being combined. In more detail, it's a paradox in which a trend that appears in different groups of data disappears when these groups are combined, and the reverse trend appears for the aggregate data. And many statisticians believe that the mainstream public should be informed of the counterintuitive results in statistics such as Simpson's paradox. In this case, the confounding factor, or lurking variable, is that the 2 states differ greatly in the proportion of students in various ethnic groups. For example, in Kansas, about 69% of the students are white. In Texas, it's 33%. This large difference in the composition of students is what makes it look like Kansas students perform better on the NAEP test than Texas students. But looking at the scores for ethnic subgroups, which state would you say has the most desirable set of NAEP scores? It's important to know that aggregated data can mask or hide underlying trends. And here's a question I have for you. Have you heard Kansas school leaders talk about this, or do they talk only about the aggregated data? So we see how the good performance of Kansas schools relative to other states is largely explained by the fact that Kansas has a large proportion of white students compared to other states. And, unfortunately, there is a performance gap, a persistent performance gap between white students and Black and Hispanic students. Well, what lesson should we take away from this? Well, believe it or not, some people have called me a racist for illustrating this data. Others have said that my solution to the problem in Kansas schools is to get rid of minority students. But both of these assertions are preposterous. But what we do need to do is to recognize the facts for what they are. And there are two ways to look at this data. Some undoubtedly will look at this and say that these test results support the need for more spending, increased spending in Kansas schools. Others might look at these results and say that even with all the spending on schools, Kansas students really aren't doing that well. But what I know for certain is this. Kansas school leaders are not being honest with you. They are not being honest with the parents of children in Kansas schools. And they're not being honest with Kansas taxpayers that pay for our schools. But most importantly, they are not being honest with Kansas school children. By continuing to trumpet a false sense of high achievement in Kansas schools as compared to other states, we simply sweep our problems under the rug. It's the children, especially the minority children, that are most harmed by this. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. Well, 2 years ago in Wichita, the economist Walter Williams delivered a lecture that featured a section covering how greed, or what some call enlightened self-interest, is the best way to produce good acts. The lecture was sponsored by the Bill of Rights Institute and was underwritten by the Fred and Mary Koch Foundation. When government is used in an attempt to do good, it requires either elimination or attenuation of private property and market forces, Walter Williams told the audience in Wichita. But it is private property and the desire by people for more that motivates people to do the difficult and laborious things that benefit their fellow man. It all happens without government. In fact, government involvement in the market reduces the motivation of people to acquire, protect, and improve private property. Well, here's a little bit of what Walter Williams said in Wichita 2 years ago. He said, "But do-gooders fail to realize that most good done in the world is not done in the name of good. If you were to ask me, Williams, what's the human motivation that gets wonderful things done? What's the human motivation that you like? Well, I tell them, greed. I love greed. Now, I'm not talking about ripping off people, fraud, and misrepresentation. I'm talking about people trying to get as much as they can for themselves. Now, consider the following, because a lot of people don't understand greed." And again, this is Walter Williams speaking. "Last winter, we had Texas cattle ranchers getting up in the dead of winter, running down stray cattle and trying to feed them, making a huge personal sacrifice to make sure that New Yorkers had beef on their shelves. And this summer, we had Idaho potato farmers getting up in the morning, doing back-breaking work, sun beating down on them, bugs biting them, making this personal sacrifice so that New Yorkers would also have potatoes. Now, why do you think they're doing that? Do you think that they're doing that because they love New Yorkers? They may hate New Yorkers. And I'm not that wild about New Yorkers myself," Williams said. "But they make sure beef and potatoes get to New York every single day of the week. And why is that? Well, because they love themselves. They're trying to get more for themselves. And this is what Adam Smith was talking about in The Wealth of Nations, that the public good is served best by the private interest. That is, by people trying to get more for themselves. And in the free market, In order to get more for yourself, you have to find ways to please your fellow man, to make your fellow man happy. Well, how much beef and potatoes do you think New Yorkers would have if it all depended on human love and kindness? I'd be worried about New Yorkers. And let me give you another example, Walter Williams said. He said, some people tell me, Williams, instead of saying greed, you're trying to win friends and influence people. Why don't you say enlightened self-interest? Well, that's okay, but I like greed instead. And he continued. He said, let me give you another example of the virtue of self-interest and private property. I have often said that I don't care much about future generations, and some people think that's awful. Some people have said, Williams, why don't you care about future generations? And I ask, what have future generations ever done for me? I mean, some kid being born in 2050, what has he done for me? And if he has not done anything for me, then how am I obliged to do anything for him? Where is the quid pro quo? But however, if you watch my actual behavior, that behavior would belie that sentiment. And Williams went on to tell this to the audience. He said, I have a very nice house and property in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Several years ago, I took $400 that I could have used to buy 2 bottles of Chateau de Coquin Saturn wine and selfishly enjoyed it all by myself. But instead, I planted some trees on my property. Now, when those trees reach full maturity, I'll be dead. There will be some 20-50 kids swinging in my trees. Mrs. Williams, who is now departed, made extensive improvements to our house, built a big sunroom, with my money, of course. But that sunroom is going to outlast both of us, and there's going to be some 20-50 kid tracking mud in my sunroom. And if you ask the question, why did I make those sacrifices of current consumption to produce something that's going to benefit someone in 2050? Well, the answer is very easy. The nicer my house is, the longer it will provide housing services, and the higher the price I get when I go to sell it. That is, by pursuing my own narrow selfish interest, I can't help but make a house available for future generations, whether I mean to or not. Now, would I have the same incentives if the government owned my house? Would I have the same incentives if there were a 75% transfer tax when I went to sell my house? Whatever weakens my private property rights interest in my house weakens my incentive to do the socially responsible thing, namely, conserve the scarce resources of our society. Well, let me give you another example, Walter Williams told the audience. I was listening to NPR, National Public Radio, a few years ago, and people were picketing the United Nations because they were concerned about the extinction of the giraffe, the gorilla, and the lion. So I wrote down a list of animals that people were in a tizzy over the possibility of their becoming extinct. Then I wrote down another list of animals, very valuable to us, but people are not worried about them. I said, how come people are not marching for the chicken? Why are people not forming Save the Pig clubs? Well, what's the difference between these two lists of animals? The essential difference is that with the list of animals, cows, chickens, and pigs, well, they belong to somebody. Somebody's personal private interest is at stake. But this other list of animals, the lions and tigers, they don't belong to anybody. Nobody's personal wealth is at stake. So if you're concerned about the extinction of various animals, I would recommend trying to privatize them. Well, that's some of a lecture that Walter Williams delivered to an audience in Wichita 2 years ago. That, I think, really illustrates the brilliance of Walter Williams in explaining economics and economic principles to us. Well, we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. Have you heard the term overcriminalization? Well, here's a video from the Cato Institute that explains this growing problem.
What is overcriminalization at the federal level? What does that mean?
Overcriminalization refers to the plethora of federal laws and regulations that are on the books now that carry criminal penalties. So whereas once we might regulate something and you get a fine for it, or you get a disciplinary proceeding by an agency, and you get slapped on the wrist that way, now instead we are creating criminal penalties for this thing. So instead, if you violate this regulation, now instead of a civil fine, you get 0 to 6 months in prison and a criminal record. And overcriminalization also just generally refers to this sort of idea that there are too many federal crimes and that people don't know what is illegal anymore.
Harvey Silverglate is a scholar here at the Cato Institute, and he's written a book called 3 Felonies a Day, arguing that the average person, most likely unwittingly, is committing an average of about 3 felonies a day. It's my understanding Representative Sensenbrenner, who's on this congressional panel that trying to deal with this problem of overcriminalization, has asked for a review of all of these criminal penalties that the federal government heaps upon these infractions. What did he find?
Well, he approached the Congressional Research Service and asked them something very simple: do a tally, go through the entire federal criminal code and find out all the different crimes on the books. And they said, I'm sorry, we can't. We don't have enough manpower. It would actually take too much time. And that just gives you a small idea of the size of this problem and the scope of it. According to Representative Sensenbrenner and the Congressional Research Service's last number, which isn't even a correct number, there are over 4,500 criminal laws and violations in our federal code scattered through multiple volumes. And that's another problem, is not all of the criminal laws are collected in one place. There's no one place you can go to check if I do this thing, is this going to be a crime? That resource doesn't exist for the American public.
To what extent are federal agencies creating penalties without the input of Congress?
Well, it's enough of a problem that the Judiciary Committee created this special task force to look at this issue. And the Judiciary Committee is the one that is supposed to look at legislation that creates crimes. They're supposed to be doing studies on it and having hearings and making sure that a crime is really necessary and appropriate. And yet when you have an agency that goes off on its own and creates a criminal penalty, that is not going to the Judiciary Committee. So it's often unaware even of criminal penalties that are being attached to regulations in other parts of the government.
This panel, what are they focusing on in terms of trying to reform the problem of overcriminalization?
Well, they're looking for solutions that will get bipartisan consent. And I think from the hearing on Friday, the big one that came out was this idea of mens rea, this idea that you shouldn't be held criminally liable for something unless you intended to commit a crime, unless you had a bad mindset of, I'm going to violate this law. And the problem with so many of these regulatory offenses is that a lot of people don't even know they're out there. When you get into a world where you have perhaps thousands of regulations that apply to a particular area, you might be doing something and fully believing that it's legal, and you might be doing it with the very best of intentions, and yet at the same time violating the law, and there's a criminal penalty attached. And for hundreds of years, we've had this idea that you should have a guilty mind to be punished criminally.
What are some examples where this has been particularly egregious?
I think some of the areas of business regulation, particularly if you're doing something where you're bringing in, say, orchids from another country, you have to file special paperwork to bring those orchids in. And if you file the wrong paperwork, there's a criminal penalty attached. And everything else about the orchids may be perfectly legal. You paid for them, you didn't steal them, they're perfectly legal to bring into the States, but because you fill out the paperwork wrong or you don't file the right paperwork, you suddenly are facing a criminal penalty.
I understand that Democrats and Republicans probably have constituencies that are different when it comes to battling the issue of overcriminalization. But to what extent is overfederalization something that they can agree on?
When you get to this idea of over-federalization, you have the concept that the federal government is prosecuting stuff that the states can handle. And this could include everything from some of these regulations that we're talking about. Not all of them need to necessarily be federal regulations. The states can handle some of that. And then also you get into the area of more standard garden variety crimes. It is a crime to sell heroin in every country, in every state in this country. It's also a federal crime. So who needs to be handling that? The states are, they have cops, they have drug squads, they have drug dogs. They're perfectly capable of going out and finding these people and prosecuting them. So when should it become a federal case? And I think that an area where we're going to see maybe some of that conversation happening more is in the area of marijuana. We have 2 states now, Colorado and Washington, where marijuana possession and sale within certain parameters is legal under state law and yet still illegal at the federal level. And so I think we need to have a serious conversation about how much is the federal government going to respect that state choice to legalize marijuana or at least decriminalize it to a large extent.
There is a doctrine in constitutional law known as non-delegation, which is effectively, as far as I understand it, dead. Is there any way to get back, you think, to a world in where Congress actually doesn't delegate all of these authorities to federal agencies?
I think the temptation to regulate is very great at the federal level. It's a difficult temptation to resist. And I think that's true in the area of criminalization too. If there's a problem, let's make it a crime and let's slap a mandatory minimum sentence on it and we'll fix the problem. It's an easy way out. And I think sometimes it gets around some of the solutions that are probably better long term, but harder to choose and harder to implement.
Well, thank you to the Cato Institute for producing that video. And believe it or not, we have problems like this right here in Wichita. An ordinance passed by the Wichita City Council in 2010 might ensnare anyone visiting City Hall if they happen to have a broad tip marker in their purse or briefcase. And here's my king-size Sharpie. Well, here's what the law says. It is unlawful for any person to have in his or her possession any graffiti implement while in, upon, or within 100 feet of any public facility, park, playground, swimming pool, skate park, recreational facility, or other public building owned or operated by the city, county, state, or federal government, or while in, under, or within 100 feet of an underpass, bridge, abutment, storm, drain, spillway, or similar types of infrastructure, unless otherwise authorized. And graffiti implements, well, my king-size Sharpie, I'm pretty sure that qualifies. And I don't know if we are within 100 feet right now in this studio of a bridge or an abutment, but we may be. I may be violating the law right now. Well, if you're thinking about being a taxi cab driver in Wichita, then let me advise you that the city has ordinances punishing you if you're found to have violated these standards, such as failing to maintain their personal appearance by being neat and clean and dressed in person, and failing to keep clothing in good repair, free of rips, tears, and stains. That's the law in the city of Wichita. Well, Winston Churchill famously said, "If you have 10,000 regulations, you destroy all respect for the law." I think we're at that point. Well, thanks for watching this episode of Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks and hope to see you again next week.